So the next piece that we're going to take a look at is basic engine construction. The engine has a lot of different parts involved, so it can be helpful to dump them into a few different big tubs so that we can begin to take a look at how they all work together. Now the way that we're going to break this down into three big assemblies, and shout out to Art of Manliness for this image, because it does a really good job of showing the big basic components in here. And the way that we're going to split this down is we're going to talk about the block, the rotating assembly, and the cylinder head. So the block is the big chunk right in the middle where the cylinders are bored and where the pistons move up and down. It contains all the pressure, it contains galleries for coolant. It is the main component of the engine. The rotating assembly includes the crank shaft and the connecting rods and pistons, the pieces that spin and turn and capture that mechanical energy that's been converted from the fuel combustion. And then also the cylinder head. So up here at the top, where the block meets the components at the top, is what's called the cylinder heads. This component is actually bolted, or these components are bolted to the block and contain the things like the valves, often the crank or the camshaft, rocker arms if they still have them, and the spark plugs. So those are the three big buckets that we're going to talk about when we talk about the construction of the motor. And you can see them all kind of labeled in this image pretty well. And there are other components. We're going to talk about those systems here in a second. So some of the things that you might see coming off of an engine are what are called manifolds. And there are generally two. So we have an intake and an exhaust manifold. When you think about a manifold, basically you're thinking about many tubes coming to be a single tube, or a single tube coming to be several tubes. So in this image you can kind of see this is an intake manifold where an air filter allows air to come through a single tube that then splits off into four that then goes into the actual engine itself. The exhaust manifold would be on the other side or on the bottom of the engine, where exhaust gases would come out of each individual cylinder but then merge together into a single tube to eventually make their way out of the tailpipe. We also have a cooling system, which consists of the radiator, the thermostat, which tells the coolant whether or not to flow through the radiator, and the coolant itself. And in this image, you can see these guys kind of have their hands near this component in the center. It kind of looks like, I don't know, a bunch of little slats that move up and down. This is just a decorative grill in the front, but the radiator itself is where the coolant will flow, and as air passes over it, it will allow heat to move away from the engine. The fluid that flows through the radiator first circulates through the engine block and sort of nabs the heat out of the engine block. And then we also need to talk about the fuel and ignition system, because if you have looked at your car, you may have seen that the fuel tank is actually often near the rear of the vehicle. So we have to get the fuel that the engine burns from the rear of the vehicle to the front of the vehicle. And we do this through a fuel pump. The fuel tank holds the fuel, the pump moves the fuel up towards the engine, and then a fuel rail or other types of distribution systems will send the fuel to injectors right before it enters the cylinder to be ignited. So those are the large main components of an engine system. And up next, what we're going to talk about is the four-stroke cycle that allows an engine to turn that fuel into mechanical motion. Thanks for listening.